I'm Henry Curr. I'm the economics editor of The Economist, and it's my pleasure to be here today in conversation with Paolo Mauro, who is the Deputy Director of the Fiscal Affairs Department at the IMF. And we're going to be talking about the Fiscal Monitor, newly released, and specifically Chapter 2 of that, entitled A Fair Shot. Paolo, what is the purpose of this chapter, and what is the main message you're trying to get across in it?
Thank you, Henry. So the title of the chapter, as you said, is A Fair Shot. And I confess we had been thinking for some time about doing a report on improving equality, not only in income, but also in opportunity. As you're well aware, inequality has been increasing for many years in several countries. And there's also a growing perception that not everybody has a fair shot at success in their lives. So we wanted to look at access to basic public services such as healthcare and education. With the pandemic, that topic has become even more prominent. We know that inequality has increased. Those who lost their jobs were people who were already at the lower end of the income scale, women, youth, members of ethnic groups that were historically disadvantaged. Additionally, what we realized, and I can tell you about some of the findings, is that pre-existing inequalities in access to healthcare and education made the impact of COVID-19 even worse. So we have a topic that was important before the pandemic and has become even more important with the pandemic. Additionally, a fair shot also evokes the most important priority for policymakers right now, the urgent need to vaccinate everybody. We know that access to vaccines, unfortunately, is still uneven within countries, but most importantly, across countries. So both of those, improving equality of opportunity and access to vaccines, are the general theme of the report. I would like to tell you a bit more about the findings, but in a nutshell, we see a rise in inequality. We see a rise in public debts because governments have had to support people and firms, and that has a fiscal cost. It's appropriate to support people, but it does imply rising public debts. And there's a need to provide those very necessary public services such as healthcare, education, and social safety nets. So if you put those things together, there's going to be a need to mobilize revenues going forward. And the report argues that we need to mobilize revenues in a way that makes it possible to support those who have suffered more and those who have done a little bit better during this crisis. Those who can afford to pay more should do so.
Can we talk a little bit about what governments should do after the pandemic to offset these trends? How persistent do you expect them to be? And how effective can governments be in leaning against the wind here?
With the increase in inequality in incomes and with the need to provide access to public services for everybody, one really needs to think about inequality in incomes, inequality in wealth, and inequality in opportunities as being very closely linked. They really are intrinsically going together. The implication is that policies should look both at redistributive measures, such as taxes and transfers, and what we call predistributive policies, meaning additional funding of healthcare and education, additional measures to improve the efficiency of those services. I'd like to give you a couple of examples. So in the area of education, all children have suffered, both in terms of personal life, but also in terms of educational losses. But some children have suffered more during this pandemic. If you look at educational losses, they tend to be greater for children who don't have access to digital means of communication. They're also greater for children whose parents have lower educational attainment. So providing additional funding for education, we find in the report, would close the enrollment gap between children who are from a less fortunate background and those who are from better off families. The most worrying finding in the report from my perspective is the projection that as a result of the pandemic, 6 million children may drop out of school permanently. So it's crucial for governments to make sure that they bring those kids back to school as soon as possible. What we've seen in previous recessions is that parents ask their children to stay away from school and help the family financially by working. That has a very long-lasting, devastating impact on their lifetime opportunities. So the pandemic could have these very permanent effects, and it's important that policymakers address them right now.
So you mentioned earlier some of the pressures on government budgets that have emerged because of the pandemic. Obviously, all these spending priorities are going to take up resources. How should governments reconcile the public desire to address some of these inequalities, your desire to address them even, with the pressure on their budgets?
Sure. So let me begin by telling you a little bit about our findings in terms of changing attitudes among the public regarding tax and expenditure policies. When we look at international surveys, what we find is that even prior to the pandemic, in most countries, people expressed the desire for more progressive taxation than at present, and also for more spending on healthcare, education, and more generally for services that benefit people directly. So that's prior to the pandemic. Then during the pandemic, in October 2020, we undertook a more specialized survey in the United States. We asked 2,500 individuals in the United States, a representative sample, about their experience during the pandemic and their policy views. And what we find is that people who were directly hurt by the pandemic, whether through COVID-19 illness of themselves or of a member of the family, or through job loss, those people were 15% more likely to say that they favor progressive taxation. So we see that there may be a shift in attitudes among the public toward a greater desire for progressive policies in general. Now, what would governments do in terms of mobilizing those additional revenues that are necessary? It depends a bit on the starting point for each country, but to simplify, for most emerging markets and for most low-income countries, the priority would be to improve tax administration and to use value-added tax or consumption taxes to a greater extent. That would give them the additional resources to be then redeployed through cash transfers or investment in healthcare and education. For advanced economies, what we've seen over the past 20 years or so is a gradual erosion in revenues collected from people who are at the top of the income scale. We've also seen an erosion in the revenues collected from corporations. So policymakers can reverse that erosion through several means. One way is to increase the tax rates on the personal income tax for people at the upper end of the income scale. Another is to close loopholes in capital gains taxation and in corporate taxation. And more generally, there is definitely scope to improve property taxes, inheritance taxes, and at the global level, one of the priorities going forward is to reach an agreement on a modernization of international corporate taxes that ensures that the largest and most profitable companies, often those are digitalized companies, that those companies pay their fair share of the burden.
You spoke there about lots of ways in which governments could permanently raise revenue. But in the report towards the end, you also talk about this possibility for temporary taxes, temporary COVID-19 recovery contributions, you call them. Could you talk a bit more about the thinking behind those and how they might work?
So one of the proposals in the report is to go back to successful historical use of temporary taxes in the aftermath of disasters. And what we propose is a COVID-19 recovery contribution where there would be a surcharge on personal income taxes or on corporate taxation. There are successful historical precedents for that. This is something that Germany did in the aftermath of unification. Australia did this in the aftermath of some floods, and Japan did it after an earthquake. So it's a way of ensuring that after a massive episode of pressure on the public finances, those who can afford to pay more make a greater contribution to the recovery effort.
Paolo, it's been great talking to you. We've been speaking about Chapter 2 of the April 2021 Fiscal Monitor, A Fair Shot. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Henry.